Urgent. Something is tearing Iran apart from the inside, and it's not just the war that shows up on maps. This Friday, April 17, 2026, what we see is the deepening of a crisis that includes attacks on the energy sector, gas shortages, blackouts, economic pressure, water shortages, and fear in the streets. At the center of this is the Iranian regime, pressured at the same time by Israel, the United States, and by its own internal wear and tear, where this is most evident. In the energy hubs, in Tehran, on the streets under surveillance, and in the Strait of Hormuz, which has become both a tool of pressure and a risk for Iran itself. How so? It escalated with attacks in March on the gas infrastructure in South Pars and Azaluyeh, followed by an economic blockade and the suspension of petrochemical exports to protect the domestic market. Why? Because the Iranian system relies too much on a few critical points, and when those points fail, the entire structure feels it. This matters because Iran doesn't just use gas for export, it needs gas to live. More than 90% of the production is consumed within the country itself, and about 85% of the electricity comes from gas power plants. When South Pars and the Azaluyeh area were hit, the fragility was laid bare. What seemed like energy strength turned into open vulnerability. The regime tried to react by diverting gas for domestic consumption and cutting external flows, but the result was worsening blackouts and increased energy insecurity. In other words, the heart of the Iranian machine kept beating, but no longer with the same strength. This helps explain why an attack on just a few points had such a heavy impact on so many people at the same time, but it's not just about energy. There's another point. Explosive, and it comes from underground, water. Iran was already entering this war carrying one of the worst water crises in its recent history. Reuters showed that Tehran was facing severe drought, declining reservoir levels, dams at critical levels, and even debates about rationing. The World Resources Institute points out that extreme water stress is when a region uses more than 80% of its available renewable supply, a scenario that dominates the Middle East and North Africa. How does this affect Iran? Because water, food, energy, and social peace go hand in hand. When one is lacking, the others also give way. And when the population sees the taps run dry, power fail, and prices rise, the regime's authority starts to lose ground, and that's where Tehran's real fear comes in. After the January protests, the response was harsh. Reuters reported arrests, executions, and a strong presence of security forces to prevent a new wave of unrest. That answers who the government truly fears at this moment. Not just external enemies, but the very population itself, exhausted by inflation, cuts, shortages, and war. Where do you see this? In Tehran and other cities, with monitored streets, checkpoints, and a suffocating atmosphere. How does power try to survive? Through force and intimidation. Why? Because it knows that an already wounded economy can break for good when the war cools down, and that may be the most delicate point of all. The regime tries to show control, but underneath it is fear of losing control. The pressure increased even more this week. According to Reuters, the blockade started by the United States on April 13th could force cuts in Iranian production within weeks or months if exports remain blocked. The calculation is tough. Without being able to ship oil, Iran needs to store it. When the storage space runs out, production drops. At the same time, Tehran suspended petrochemical exports to prioritize the domestic market after the damage to centers like Azaluyeh and Machar. Who pays the price? The Iranian economy, which was already struggling, now has to choose between external revenue and internal survival. How does this add up? It doesn't add up well. And that's why the feeling of strain today isn't propaganda. It's real, visible, and growing pressure. That's why what's tearing the nation apart isn't a single missile, a single embargo, or a single statement from an authority. It's the brutal sum of energy dependence, water crisis, repression, isolation, and war. Those who try to sell the image of total control are hiding the essential. The regime is still able to attack, threaten, and resist, but it's more exposed than it seems. When the pillars of energy, water, economy, and internal order weaken at the same time, the shock stops being isolated and becomes structural. And today, Iran is experiencing exactly that. A rupture from within, increasingly visible, increasingly heavy, and increasingly difficult to hide.